What if I told you there's an official document provided by Apple that shows how an employee communicated with her? And what's more, it gives a clue as to the meaning of the numbers that the refiners work with and even involves Patricia Arquette, who is the actress who plays Mrs. Cobel. Can you believe it? Let's analyze the Lexington letter and Peg Kincaid's story together. Come with me. Hey there, my dear friends. I'm Diogo Alpendra, and welcome to another episode of View. With me, on the Severance Rupture profile on Instagram, we did an analysis of the Lexington letter, an official document from the series that's considered canonical to the Severance universe. But over there, the characters are limited, so here we'll be able to do a complete analysis of this material. Do you already know the story? Shall we analyze all of this together in this video? Alright, let's go. The PDF file provided by Apple in ebook format shows the email exchange between a reporter and her editor, along with a whistleblower letter that tells the story of Peg Kincaid, a former employee of Lumon in Topeka, which is a city in Kansas. In this letter addressed to a reporter from the Topic Star newspaper, she shares a bit of her story and how she got into Lumon. She mentions that before joining Lumon, she was a school bus driver, and one day she had an accident and was stuck on the road for hours. And here it's interesting because Peggy gives us a first clue. She says that before joining Lumon, she was a school bus driver, and one day she had an accident and was stuck on the road for hours. She mentions that even though she was 50 years old, the kids used to call her Baby Driver, referencing the action movie of the same name. What's interesting here is that this movie was released in 2017. So, this whole story takes place after that date. Back to the letter. After that accident, she made the decision that she needed to look for another job. And here she gives us a second clue. While we saw that Mark and Pitty joined Lumon to escape their emotional pains, Mark from the loss of Gemma, and Pitty, although we don't know the reason, June hints that he might have chosen Severance to run away from his problems, whatever she means by that. In this case, Peggy was drawn in, as she puts it, by a salary 4 times higher than what she was making before, for a job she thought would be an office job, like a macro data refiner, at the cost of having to go through the severance procedure. Peggy also mentions that she worked at Lumon for 2 years, so from 2017 to 2018, which is when the movie Baby Driver was released, plus the 2 years she worked at Lumon. We're talking about 2019 and 2020, which is roughly the time frame we saw in the series. As an example of the date that appears on Mark's driver's license, Peggy says that everything was going really well, until one fine day she got out of the elevator on the severance floor and noticed that there was a note in her pocket. And that's it, folks. The note was Peggy's first contact with her INE. But how is that possible? And what about those code detectors? So, Peggy shares that when she was a kid, she and her sister, who are about the same age, created a language called Publish. This language was based on code, almost like a cryptogram, where each symbol replaces a letter of the alphabet. And she says she was really shocked when she pulled the note out of her pocket with the symbols that she and her sister had created over 30 years ago. She explains that in the note, her Peg K mentions that in the past few weeks, the symbol has been popping up in her memory, and she even caught herself writing those symbols during work hours. And here we have an interesting tidbit. We know that INIs are kind of like kids in a learning phase, and that can make them a little more susceptible to memories from that phase. Her INI remembered a writing code that she used to exchange messages with her sister over 30 years ago. Furthermore, this demonstrates a huge loophole, not just in the chip's configuration, which, like Irwin, allows a gap between the memories of the alt and the INI, but mainly a gap in Lumos security that allowed for the exchange of encrypted messages. Hallie raises this issue in one of the episodes, questioning whether there really is a code detector and saying that it sounds like nonsense. Could Hallie be right? What if her alt has that knowledge and unconsciously passed that information to Arain, making her doubt the existence of the detectors? I confess that I also have my doubts, and I think the experiences that Mark shares with Hallie are much more about Lumon controlling the minds of INIs than actually having a technology that detects codes within a message on a pen cap. What do you think about that? Comment here if you think it's worth making a special video to talk about this. Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. Going back, he and her INI exchanged messages for weeks and even became friends, as she mentions in the letter, was passing information from the outside world to her INI and also receiving information from inside, completely breaking the confidentiality that they value so much. But the harmony ends when Swain sends her a message all excited saying she finished a file called Lexington, and that file was so complex that she was rewarded with a melon party and was congratulated by her bosses at Lumon. She mentions that she completed that file at 2:30 p.m. that same day, a Friday. That same night, while Peggy was at home watching TV, she came across a reporter named Daria Thorne. This reporter was covering an explosion that happened with a truck from a competing company of Lumon, the Dorn Therapeutics, and she mentions that this explosion happened exactly at 2:32 that same day, which means 2 minutes after finished the Lexington file. She mentioned that this accident resulted in fatalities and there was no indication that it was accidental. At that moment, she believed that these two events were somehow connected. What do you think? Suspicious, right? Afraid of exposing her to such a situation, and also being an accomplice in a conspiracy involving murder and even industrial espionage, she sent a message asking her to investigate what those numbers were. From that point on, her life became a nightmare. Her INI started being monitored, and the exchange of messages between them became more and more sporadic, until one day, when she got out of the elevator on the Rupture floor, she noticed that her hair was wet. On the dashboard of her car was a note from Lumon saying that she had bumped into a water cooler, along with a gift card from Murray's Buffet. As we saw with Mark when he got a phone call to the head from Harry in episode 1. Could Murray be another member of the Egan family? This one doesn't show up in the perpetuity. At that moment, despite fearing for her innie, Peg decided not to resign until she had more information about all this. After all, resigning would be like killing Peggy INI, and with that, also killing her new best friend. What a dilemma, right? 2 weeks later, once again as Peg got out of the elevator, she felt something at the back of her pants. It was the guidebook for the macrodata refiner, and along with it, a note that said Dooley, the head of security, had found the last note that Alt had sent to her INE, and she also said that she thought Peg was right about the Lexington file and handed over the macrodata refiner book so she could investigate, and said that the code detectors were being updated and that they could only send because they were still offline. Have you guys seen this guidebook? Comment here if you want a video totally dedicated to him. After all these years of watching films and series, it is very clear that all the information conveyed in an audiovisual work has some purpose, and in a well-thought-out series like Severance, with brilliant minds like Dan Erickson and Ben Stiller, that message wasn't conveyed for nothing. Do you really think the numbers have any practical significance for the story of Severance? I think so. Now back to Peg's story. After more than a week of complete silence between IN and Out, on a Friday, Out, Peg, desperate to get any information about her IN, sends her a note in publish asking if she was okay. 10 minutes after stepping into the Severance elevator, she comes out shaking with her IN's response. Peggy, get out now. Go to a safe place. They're going to try to follow you. None of what they say is true. Thank you for my life. You were the best part. I will always be with you. What did Peggy do? She called Lumon, quit her job, and left Topeka. After feeling like she was being followed by black cars and having her mail tampered with, she decided to go to a hotel and send the letter and the guidebook to the journalist she saw in the article about the truck explosion. Chasing black cars. Doesn't that remind you a lot of the black car we saw when Mark went to Pips? When reporter Daria Thorne received this information from, she sent an email to her editor Jim asking if she could go ahead with the story. He replied that she should focus on the city's amateur basketball playoffs and that he had talked to a source inside Lumon who said that he had been fired for too many fouls and probably made up this story to get back at Lumon. In another email, Daria said that she could reconcile the basketball playoff with this story and that if this story were really true, it would be good. Dean, the editor, replied to that email saying it didn't make sense to keep investigating the story because he saw in the obituary that Peggy Kincaid had died in a car accident. He also mentioned that it didn't make sense to risk a defamation lawsuit against Lumo and reminded her of what happened with the Nashville Tribune when they published what they thought was a reliable story about the feeding tubes. They got sued and went bankrupt 6 months later. Remember the feeding tubes? That's what Cobel has at home, which had Charnot's name on it. Could she have any connection to this story? This story is full of mysteries, but it all seems kind of connected, doesn't it? Now, guess the last name of the editor that appears in the emails. Dean Miltic. That name sounds familiar, doesn't it? I wonder if in every city where Luma operates, there's a Miltic of their own. You know there's a theory about that, right? Comment below if you want to know more about this theory. But check this out. Peggy died a day after sending the letter and the booklet to Daria Thorne. Now I'm about to drop a bombshell. Get ready. When the series was in pre-production, several interviews were conducted to promote this launch on Apple. In one of those interviews, Patricia Arquette was on a show, and the name of the character she was going to play appeared right below her. And guess what name she was introduced by? Yeah, that's right. Peggy was the initial idea to present the story of Peggy Kincaid, but then they decided to go another route and just leave that material as canon, like additional material. Or could Cobel have some connection to this story? Something tells me we're going to find that out in the next season. As we said, this content can and should really be considered as supporting material for what we see in the series. So that's it. Were you surprised by this analysis? We're on our way to becoming the most specialized channel on, and we need you to get there. And keep following the channel for all the analyses and theories about every episode and the materials out. And if you hadn't seen any of this before, now you have with me.